Good morning. Good morning. And I really mean good morning. I love mornings. The earlier the better. My wife calls me annoyingly chirpy in the mornings. She says, I do not want you to look at me or talk to me before 11 a.m. Because as you know, there are only two kinds of people in the world, those who love to get up early and those who hate those who love to get up early. And you know which camp I am in. Delighted to share this day with you as we start exploring together the core values that we hold sacred in the Potomac Conference, beginning with the foundational value of the whole spiritual journey. And what we want is to do this journey wisely and well, right? Is that better? Okay, try it again. Good morning. Now, would you agree that there is a difference between being book smart and biblically wise? Right? Like, you can have more degrees than a thermometer and still mess up life, right? You can be really smart and yet lack wisdom. I'll tell you my favorite story on this. You probably remember it, that of Randy Johnson, who used to play quarterback for Oklahoma State University. He was an average quarterback on a mediocre team that year, but he knew that he, along with all of his teammates, could be elevated to the status of superhero on campus if somehow they could pull off the unlikely upset, the final game of the year against their arch-state rivals from the University of Oklahoma. Well, things weren't looking very well for Randy and the boys. With time remaining for just one last play, they needed to cover about 80 yards of real estate in order to score a touchdown and win the game. Well, as just a gesture of support to all of the seniors, the coach for that last play of the game put in all of the seniors and even told Randy, look, you can call whatever play you want. And so he called play number 13, which surprised everybody in the huddle because it was a trick play that they had never executed well in practice, let alone with the whole season on the line. But that's what he called, and wouldn't you know it, they pulled it off and won the game, carried Randy off on their shoulders. Well, the coach couldn't wait to corner Randy in the locker room. He had to know, what on earth possessed you to make such a gutsy call? Play number 13. What were you thinking? In retrospect, genius, but why did you call that? And he said, well, Coach, you got to understand, it was really emotional in that huddle. We all knew that this was our last play of our college football careers. And I looked over to my buddy Mark, been playing football together for 4 years. He was wearing the jersey number 8, and then right next to him, Randy, wearing number 7. And so I just added them up and called play number 13. See, you're teachers. I knew you were going to get that. And the coach said, okay, but Randy, 8 plus 7 doesn't equal 13. Randy thought about it for a moment, and finally he said, well, you're right, Coach, but if I was as smart as you, we'd have lost the game. A lot of really smart people in the world who lose the game because they lack biblical wisdom. They don't do the journey, especially that spiritual journey, wisely and well. And so as we think about this, I want to consult with you today the journal of the wisest man who has ever lived, King Solomon, exploring in his journal principles that can help us on our own spiritual journeys. Now, to simplify this, I want to break down the spiritual journey into 4 seasons. Each season comprised of 25 years. So, if you are 25 years old or younger, you are in the spring season of life. If you are between ages 26 and 50, you are in the summer season of life. You're doing the math, aren't you? How many of you are already depressed that you're right near the winter season of life? All right. Well, let's look at the counsel that Solomon gives us as we go on this spiritual journey through the different seasons of life, beginning with the spring season. To those of you who find yourself in this era of life, this is the counsel that he has. Be happy, young man, while you are young. And let your heart give you joy in the days of your youth. Find joy in the days of your youth. He says, be happy in this spring season of life. Now, what's so ironic about this? A lot of research and scholarship around the topic of happiness these days. And what social scientists are discovering that, believe it or not, so many young people today report being very unhappy. Can you imagine? I mean, you think about this. And kids these days, they have every convenience imaginable with all of our technology and sophistication, and yet how can they not be happy? You would think they would be deliriously happy, right? One study conducted by UNICEF surveyed young people in the 21 most developed countries in the world, and then they ranked them. The most unhappy young people to the happiest young people. Anybody want to guess where America landed on that list? We weren't last, next to last. The only young people who are more unhappy than American kids, England. It's interesting that the countries that ranked highest were the Scandinavian countries. And social scientists explain it's because they do community well. I'm thinking about the Amish community and others that give kids context and connection with one another. William Falk in The Week Journal adds his commentary to that study. He said it'd be comforting to shrug off the report as pure anti-American buncombe. But as a parent of a teen and a tween, I cannot. I've seen firsthand the emptiness that haunts so many middle-class kids. From an early age, they are taught that life is this pitiless pursuit of individual gratification and success, requiring above-average brains and above-average looks. There's no sense of context or community or higher purpose. It's hardly surprising, then, that so many of them are taking antidepressants, ADHD meds, or other pills. Many more hide their sadness in eating disorders, drugs, meaningless hookups. In our rush to give our children everything, I am afraid we have forgotten to help them answer a question that will not go ignored. What is this all for? The question Solomon wrestled with. What is the purpose of all of this? And he cries out, it's meaningless. Meaningless. One paraphrase renders it, it's all cotton candy. And so he says to young people, In the spring era of life, be happy. Remember your Creator. Connect with God. Because it's not long, and we find ourselves then in the summer season of life. This is when we strive to make our mark in the world. When we obsess over being successful. When we want to get that second car and the yacht and the big home and the fat portfolio, and we want to be successful, and nobody did it as well as Solomon. He writes in his journal, I undertook great projects. I built great houses for myself. I planted vineyards. I made gardens and parks and planted all kinds of fruit trees in them. I made reservoirs to water groves of flourishing trees. I bought male and female slaves and had other slaves who were born in my house. I also owned more herds and flocks than anyone in Jerusalem. I amassed silver and gold. He was wildly successful, extremely wealthy. In fact, 1 Kings chapter 10 reports that one of many revenue sources generated, get this, 666 talents of gold. Today's rough equivalency would be about $340 million from one of several revenue sources. Can you imagine? $340 million. That's more than I make in a whole month. And this is the same man who, as he's reflecting on his life, screams out, it's meaningless. I have all this stuff, but it doesn't really make me any happier. Last year, Harvard University published the results of a really interesting study they did where they interviewed 4,000 multimillionaires. All of them valued at tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. Extremely wealthy people. They asked, so how happy are you on a scale of 1 to 10? Only 13% of the multimillionaires responded by answering a 10. And so with the rest of them, they posed the question, how much money would it take for you to change your answer to a 10? How much money would it take for you to be happy? The most popular answer, 10 times more. And it didn't matter if the person was worth $10 million or $100 million. They held on to this delusion. If I just had 10 times more, then I would be happy. No wonder Solomon says, I've been down that road. I'm telling you, it's meaningless. It's not long. And the summer season shifts into autumn, where we begin to reflect a lot about some of these things that haunt us as we're trying to figure out what is it truly that gives purpose and meaning to life. What is it that genuinely makes us happy? And so to those of us in the autumn season of life, Solomon writes this, chapter 9, verse 9, enjoy life with your wife, whom you love. He's beginning to figure out that really what matters in life, meaningful connections with one another and with God. And so he says, enjoy your life with the people who are close to you. All the days of this meaningless life, he goes on, that God has given you under the sun. All your meaningless days, for this is your lot in life, and your toilsome labor under the sun. Whatever your hand finds to do, do it with all of your might, for in the grave where you are going there is neither working nor planning nor knowledge nor wisdom. So long as you have another day of life, enjoy it, because we are all going to the grave, aren't we? And it goes by so quickly, doesn't it? Now, I got to tell you, we're in a major transition right now. Some of you have asked me, so when are you moving to Loma Linda? We're still working at Kettering Church till November or so, and then we're going to move to Loma Linda and add to all of this change in our lives after we have been at Kettering over 12 years. We're also now newly empty nesters. And so there's just a lot of adjustment going on in the Haffner home these days. And I've been thinking a lot about what we're talking about today, just the whole spiritual journey and doing life wisely and well. And so the other day I posted my thoughts on Facebook. It's kind of a lengthy reading, but I'm going to share it with you anyway, because it just occurred to me that, you know, it's going so quickly. And I wrote it in Denver after driving a couple days with my daughter Claire. And so I wrote, in the past 2 days, I've walked Skipper, our dog, celebrated 33 years of marriage with Cherie, cruised with Claire from Dayton to Denver en route to dropping her off at a dorm room. The morning dawned overcast and misty. Skipper and I strolled the usual 2 miles in a light rain. I thought of when we moved to Dayton. Claire was in first grade. And Skip was a newborn puppy. The tugging on Skip's leash has now given way to lagging as he totters to keep up. We got back and had a hurried 33-year anniversary celebration over scrambled eggs and tofu. It was a non-traditional anniversary cake. Knowing that we had 600 plus miles of driving that day, the goodbyes were quick. Soon we were cruising west. One can do a lot of reflecting along Interstate 70 in Kansas. Amen. I thought of how this daddy-daughter ritual of driving from Dayton to Walla Walla has become a much-anticipated sacred ritual dating back to the 3 treks that Lindsay and I have enjoyed. This time, however, it's different. Doesn't seem right knowing that at the other end of the 3,000 miles, Auntie Carrie won't be there, with popcorn popped and Parent Trap cued on the TV to start Claire's college career with a quick indulgence before the studying would begin. Losing Auntie Carrie to cancer exactly a year ago today has shredded all semblance of predictability in life. Taking days and people for granted. Not a day passes when we do not feel the raw anguish of her absence. Oh, how we cherish the memories of her laughter, her wisdom, her kindness. Yesterday, as I was walking Skip in the wet fog, the words of James came to my mind. What is your life, he asks. Then he answers, you are a mist that appears for a little while and then vanishes. Yesterdays disappear quickly. You got today. So, savor every second. Love every person. And take to heart the words of Auntie Carrie. If the chips are too small, open the other bag. Life is way too short to make salsa eating terrible. Now that's good wisdom right there, isn't it? Life's just way too short not to do it well. Enjoy life with one another and with God, because soon autumn changes to winter. Solomon goes on to say, remember your Creator in the days of your youth, in the spring season of life, before the days of trouble come. And then he goes through this wonderfully graphic description of the winter season of life, the days of trouble, if you will. When he says, the grinders cease because they are few. What are the grinders? Any guesses? Teeth. Your teeth start falling out in the winter season. And those looking through the windows grow dim. What are the windows? Of course, we have to start wearing glasses as we get older. I have a good friend, Ed, who is conference president. Through the years, he always would tease me because I have terrible eyesight. I have to wear contacts. And he never had to wear glasses. And he would always rib me about being so old and how he had 20/20 vision. Well, when I happened into him not long ago, I noticed he had a pair of glasses resting on the top of his head. And so I couldn't miss the opportunity to say, oh, I see now. He quickly grabs them, shoves them in his pocket, you know. I only need them when I drive. I said, well, why don't you just get a prescription windshield? When men rise at the sound of birds, but all their songs grow faint. This is so insightful. When men rise at the sound of birds, in other words, just the chirping keeps them awake at night, because as we get older, it's harder and harder to get a good night's sleep, right? You never hear little kids at the breakfast table, so Johnny, how'd you sleep last night? They don't talk like that. And he says, but their songs grow faint. In other words, we don't hear as well as we used to. When the almond tree blossoms, have you ever seen an almond tree in full blossom? It's just this brilliant, bright gray, white. In other words, our hair, if we are so lucky to have hair in the winter season of life, turns gray, white. When the grasshopper drags himself along, it's a graphic description, isn't it? When they giddy up and goes, just kind of gotten up and left. When the skin under a woman's elbow gets all baggy and wrinkly. Actually, that's not in the Bible. But if I had written the Bible, it would be. When the desire is no longer stirred. You may be young now, but pretty soon the grinders are going to fall out. Windows are going to grow dim. Now, it's important to note that Solomon is not saying we have to do everything we can to avoid the winter season of life and the days of trouble. I mean, he's not suggesting we all go get Botox and we do everything we can to stay young. His point is that every season of life can be rich and meaningful when we're connected with one another, when we are intimate with God, when we do the spiritual journey well. I love the words of Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who writes, how much easier it is then, how much more receptive we are to death, when advancing years guide us softly to our end. Aging thus is in no sense a punishment from on high, but brings its own blessing and warmth of colors all its own. There is even warmth to be drawn from the waning of your own strength. Compared with the past, just to think how sturdy I once used to be. You can no longer get through a whole day's work at a stretch, but how good it is to slip into the brief oblivion of sleep. And what a gift to wake up once more to the clarity of your second or your third morning of the day. And your spirit can find delight in limiting your intake of food, in abandoning the pursuit of novel flavors. Growing old serenely is not a downhill path, but an ascent. You see, here's the bottom line. Every season of the spiritual journey can be rich when we live in community, when we live connected to God. And so at the end of his journal, Solomon says, now all has been heard. Here's the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of mankind. Fear God. Live by his commandments. Do life's journey well, wisely. I cannot read the book of Ecclesiastes without thinking back to a funeral where I officiated for a woman who had been married to her husband for over 50 years. At the conclusion of the service, all of the people in this big sanctuary shuffled by the open casket until the only person left was her husband. I stood there next to him and lowered my gaze as I noticed he took her hand into his hand one last time. And I stared at their hands, remembering the stories they had shared with me to share in her celebration of life service. I thought about how they met. The first time they held hands. He told me it was at a barn party in northern Idaho. First time he saw her, he said, it was like I couldn't breathe. She was so beautiful. It took me 2 hours to muster up the courage to finally ask her to dance, but when I took her hand into my sweaty, cold hand, and as we started twirling around that dance floor, I knew I met my soulmate for life. I pictured their hands at the altar, slipping gold bands on each other's fingers, promising to God and before witnesses, till death do us part. I thought of their hands in the delivery room, him tightly squeezing hers, whispering words of encouragement. You're doing great, sweetheart. Hang in there. We almost have our healthy, beautiful son. And then for a very short season of life, there were 2 chubby little hands between theirs and 4 and 6 as they had 3 children. But of course, it wasn't long at all, and those kids were grown and gone. I thought about their hands, the big celebration, now polka-dotted with age spots, the hand shivering a little bit with early onset of Parkinson's. As they each took the handle of that knife and sliced through the 50-year anniversary wedding cake. And then their hands, as they once again, as they had done 5 decades earlier, fed each other a piece of cake. I thought of their hands in the more recent days. The kids told me how her doctor said to their dad that it would be helpful if he could rub her hands and her feet to increase circulation as she battled cancer. And so they said every time we went to visit Mom and Dad, we found Dad faithfully sitting right next to Mom, rubbing her feet, rubbing her hands. And now one last time, takes her hand into his. And in that moment, he looked up to me and he said, with kind of a coy smile on his face, he said, it seems like yesterday. We were swirling around that dance floor in Idaho. He said the 50-plus years, it went by just like that. And he snapped his fingers. It echoed in this cavernous, empty sanctuary. Of course, we all know how true that is, don't we? It just goes by like that. And so as long as God gives to each of us the gift of today, do the spiritual journey well. Live wisely. Connected to one another, to your students in the classroom, to your members in your church, to your colleagues in the conference. Connect with one another and live with God in his name.